Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean History. In today's video of Medieval Professions, we are going to take a look at a topic that my patron suggested, Bishop King. And it's about taxation and how taxes were collected. Taxes have been around in one form or another since the beginning of civilization. But today we will have a look at the taxation in medieval times, which was the system of raising money for royal and government expenses. Today we will be talking about the general tax paid by the people, import and export taxes, and tolls. And in this video we will be primarily looking at England. There were a lot of different types of taxes throughout this period, such as property tax, sales tax, import tax, head tax, tolls, and so on. The one kind of tax that wasn't found in the Middle Ages was income tax, at least not the kind of income tax we know today. And the reason why this is because essentially no one had what we would call a regular income. It could vary from day to day. In the early Middle Ages, land tax was most prominent, but we will talk about why that was later on. But first we will go over who would have collected these taxes and how they were calculated. In Anglo-Saxon England, the reeve was an official with local responsibility for keeping the peace throughout a shire or a county on behalf of the king. In other words, he was the chief magistrate of a town or a district. And a reeve would generally rank below an alderman, which would later be called an earl. Land was divided into a large number of hides, which is a unit that defines an area which is able to support one household. While this sounds as a unit of land, it was actually more used as a measurement of value and used for tax assessment. A hide did not have a standardized size. Different properties with the same hidage could vary greatly in size, even those who were in the same county as each other, or even the same hide in different time periods could have a different land area. That was because assessments that would define the size of a specific hide were changed from time to time and not always consistently. It all depended on how useful your land was. If it was less useful, the hide would include a larger area, and if it was more useful, it would be a smaller area. This depended on a large range of factors, but it would have been things like how fertile the land was or how much of the land was farmable. A variety of different types of taxes were calculated using this hide system, which could include food rent, so payments paid to the local lord in the form of produce from their lands, or the amount of manpower you had to provide for the army. So this already existing system was then also used later on to collect the geld land tax, which was paid in actual money. And it's this last type of taxes, paid using money, that we will focus on today. So the hide system was mainly used in the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. And when the king demanded a tax, he could then say, I want to receive this much per hide. 10 hides were classed as tithings, and a group of 10 tithings made 100, named after the amount of hides that they consisted of. So each 100 was supervised by an official from the crown. And groups of hundreds formed shires, with each shire being under the control of an earl. So the hide system became the basis of assessment of land for the purpose of taxation. Each unit had a court and an officer to implement decisions of that court. That would have been the reeves we talked a little bit about earlier. Thus there were also different types of reeves appointed, which his position and title could depend on the area of land they were in charge of. So you had titles such as High Reeve, Town Reeve, Port Reeve, Reeve of the Hundred, Reeve of the Manor, and the Shire Reeve, which is a position that would later evolve to become the Sheriff. And among other things such as keeping the king's peace, they were also in charge of overseeing if people paid their taxes to the king. In the 9th century, King Alfred the Great established the Danegeld, a tax of 1 penny per hide collected to pay off the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons had been fighting the Vikings, and eventually they worked out a treaty The Vikings could rule in the Danelaw, the area of England which they had taken over already, and the Vikings would also receive payments from the Anglo-Saxons, and in return the Vikings would stop raiding the Anglo-Saxon lands. Thus this land tax was raised to collect the money to pay for it. And that's why this land tax became known as the Danegeld. This type of geld tax was implemented periodically, even after the Vikings were gone. In the year 1012, an annual tax, Heregeld, meaning army tax, was implemented by King Ethelred the Unready to pay for mercenaries to reinforce the army and navy in the face of an invasion of England once again by the Vikings. After the Norman conquest, feudalism was introduced, which resulted in the development of a new administrative system in addition to the local courts from the Anglo-Saxon times, which I mentioned earlier. Now the land was divided on a manorial basis. The areas where the land was divided into would be ruled by a lord housed in a central manor, and with stewards who worked for the lord acting as the managers of the landlords in their domain. The Norman office of bailiff replaced the previously mentioned local reeves of Anglo-Saxon times, and the bailiff would have had similar tasks as these reeves. However, bailiffs also had assistants to carry out their tasks, and the term of reeve now became known as the term to refer to the assistants of a steward or a bailiff. Reeves acted generally as the overseer of the serfs and peasants within the manor's domain. So basically they did the same job as before, but now in the name of the bailiff or steward instead of directly for the king. They were also responsible for many aspects of finances of the manor, such as supervising the sale of produce, collection of taxes, and making sure the payments made by the manor were delivered. From the reign of King Henry II, pipe rolls give us a mostly continuous record of royal revenues and taxation throughout the years. Taxation took a number of forms during this period, but the main tax was still a form of Anglo-Saxon geld tax, so a land tax based on the Hyde system. Because it was assessed on the land someone owned, the tax only applied to landowners, and thus serfs and slaves were exempt. Other exemptions were granted over the years as well, to the favorite subjects of the king or as a perk granted with a certain governmental office. Because of this, the geld tax was becoming unpopular, and because the increasing number of exemptions, it yielded a smaller amount as before, so from 1162 onwards it stopped being collected. A new type of tax was imposed in 1166. This tax was based on the value of movable property and to a certain extent also income, instead of land. So this type of taxation was getting closer to a taxation based on the wealth someone had. This was not an annual tax, and it could be implemented at different rates depending on the need. For example, in 1188, funds for a proposed crusade by Henry II were levied at a rate of 10% on all personal property, with some exemptions for a nice horse and armor, as well as clerical items. And those who pledged to go on the crusade with the king were also exempt. In other years, different rates were set, such as in 1194 when a tax of 25% was imposed as part of the attempt to raise the ransom to release King Richard, who was held captive in Austria. By the mid-1200s, the tax on movable property had become fixed, at 1/15 of their value for those living in the country and 1/10 for those living in towns. This type of tax had its problems as well, as you might imagine, because it's hard to value how much each person's possessions are worth, which could lead to some inconsistencies. And in 1334, the individual assessments were replaced by a tax based on the community you lived in. The revenues from the traditional sources of taxation declined in later medieval England, and a series of experimental poll taxes, also known as head taxes, were being implemented. Instead of being based on land or value of property, these new taxes were taxed per person living in England, and the unpopularity of these types of taxes contributed to the peasants' revolt. As you might have noticed, taxes during the Middle Ages were far from standardized, and they for the most part weren't on a yearly basis. They changed in form and severity in different years, depending on the realm's need for money. It wouldn't be until the more modern ages that annual taxes as we know them today developed. Besides taxes on land and personal property, there were also taxes regarding trade. In 1202, King John imposed a customs duty of 1/15 of the value of all goods imported or exported out of England. These duties were discontinued in 1206, but in 1275 King Edward I re-established these national customs duties. And he then added another tax on top, the Maltol tax in 1294, which applied on bags of wool, one of England's biggest exports during that time. These taxes were in addition to the previously mentioned custom duties, so as you can imagine the people were not happy, and that's why these taxes were abolished in 1296. But in 1303 they were reimposed, but this time only for non-English merchants. Throughout the Middle Ages, individual cities or towns could also set taxes for anything coming in the city, and they could also tax on transactions made in their markets. At each major English port, there was a customs house, where the officials in charge of import and export taxes were based. London's first recorded customs building was constructed at Wool Quay by the Sheriff of London in 1382. As you might recall from earlier, this position of sheriff had evolved from the Anglo-Saxon position of reeve as well, the shire reeve to be specific. The sheriff in these times would not collect the customs himself, however. Officials were appointed to do that as collectors and controllers. The last thing I want to talk about in this video are tolls. Tolls were very common in the medieval period, and you could find them in a variety of different places. For example, in some cities you would have to pay a toll to get into the city. The money collected from these tolls would then go to the city's maintenance. Or for example, you also have toll roads. You still have some of them today, so tolls would be collected for people who want to go down a certain road, as money to retain that road. Bridges needed maintenance as well, so sometimes to go over a bridge you would be tolled, and that money would go to the maintenance of that bridge. And that's where that type of story of like the troll under the bridge comes in.
You gotta pay the troll toll to get in.
Well, there weren't actual trolls in the medieval times, but people would have been on the bridge collecting the toll. While these tolls went to a good cause, the maintenance of whatever you paid it for, this was also easily exploited by bandits, who could make themselves out to be a toll collector and steal money that way. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Again, this was suggested by my patron Bishop King. If you're interested in becoming a patron, or if you want to check out my Patreon page, a link will be down in the description below. On screen right now you can also see a playlist of my Medieval Professions series, and if you're interested in history as a whole, you can subscribe to my channel as well.